When Jesus said, "This generation will not pass away," which generation was he talking about? In this video, I'll show you by reading the text in its context. In this series, I'm explaining the entire Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24 and 25. If you haven't seen the previous video, it will be helpful to watch it first. In it, I showed the key to unlocking the difficulty of this passage is to compare Matthew and Luke's version. While Matthew includes two concerns the disciples have, Luke only has the first. When will the temple be destroyed? Not the second. What is the sign of Jesus' second coming? Because the two passages are in parallel, we know that Matthew 24, verse 4 through 35, is only Jesus' answer about the destruction of the temple in our past, and all the rest is about the second coming in our future. Now, this is actually confirmed by the part we are looking at now about this generation not passing away. That comes at the end of Christ's answer to the first question about the temple's destruction. So I'm going to skip down there, but I'll come back to the beginning in later videos. Let's read Matthew 24, verse 32. "From the fig tree learn her parable. When you see her branch become tender and the leaves sprout, you know that summer is near. In the same way also, when you see all these things, you know that it is near at the door. Truly I say to you that this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will certainly not pass away." Now we can know that Jesus is referring to all the description he gives in the preceding verses, 4 through 31, because he says these things will take place. That was the disciples' first concern. When they pointed to the stones of the temple, Jesus said in verse 2, "Do you not see all these things? There will not be one stone left on another." Then the disciples asked in verse 3, "When will these things be?" Jesus finishes his answer in verse 34 by saying all these things will take place before this generation is gone. And remember, these same words are repeated in Luke's gospel, which is only about the destruction of the temple. However, the big controversy is over the phrase, "this generation." When read in context, Jesus is telling the disciples that their generation, the ones living at that time, would see the temple's destruction, which they did in 70 AD. Question: if you went to a meeting and the speaker said, "This generation is seeing many technological advances," who would he be talking about? Well, you and the people living in the same time as you. What Jesus says is just as straightforward, but there are many Bible teachers who deny it. These Bible teachers will say, Jesus was not referring to the people who were living at his time, but to a future generation, far off in time. They will say, well, Jesus said this generation, but he really meant that generation which will see these events begin to take place. But if that's what he meant, why didn't Jesus say that? You can say all that in Aramaic, which they spoke, and in Greek, which they wrote. Again, I ask you, is Jesus a poor communicator? No. Jesus is the best communicator ever. He said what he meant to say, knowing it would have been understood by his original audience. In addition, Jesus uses words that make it clear when he says this generation instead of that generation. We have different pronouns in English for things that are near versus things that are far. It's the same in Greek. There are near pronouns and far pronouns. And Jesus uses the near pronoun since he's talking about this generation he walked among, near in time, not that generation far away in time. Another thing you might hear from teachers who want to deny that Jesus meant what he said is that the phrase this generation refers to the Jewish people, the race of Jews. Now, there's no reason to think it means that in this context, but let's test that theory out and see what Jesus meant by it. Earlier in his ministry, people are asking Jesus to show them a sign. Do a miracle to prove yourself. And in Luke 11:29, he responds, "This generation is an evil generation. It seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah." So if this generation means the race of the Jews, then Jesus is saying here, the race of Jews is an evil race. Is that what they teach? No. Those who would make this substitution in Matthew 24 would never make it here, because then Jesus is anti-Semitic, And the Bible becomes anti-Semitic, and all the hatred of Jews that has exploded since the Hamas attack in Israel on October 7th would be justified by the Bible. No, they would never make that substitution here, and that proves that they only make it there because they have an agenda to prop up their tradition. And Jesus said, by your traditions you void the word of God. Jesus continues in Luke 11, as Jonah became a sign to the people of Nineveh, so will the Son of Man be to this generation. The sign of Jonah was being 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a fish. Similarly, Jesus was 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. So let me ask you, was Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection 3 days later a sign only for the race of the Jews, or for the Gentiles also? Yes, for the Gentiles also. So this generation does not mean the Jews as a race. Now, why is it that well-meaning evangelical Bible teachers resort to scripture twisting here, even changing the very words of Jesus? Oddly enough, it's because they think they are saving Jesus from himself. They think that this first part of Matthew 24 is about the second coming. It's not. So when Jesus says to his disciple, all these things will happen in your lifetime, for them, that would mean Jesus predicted his second coming before the disciples had all died. Then Jesus would be a false prophet. In fact, there are atheists and other skeptics who use just this argument to reject the Bible as truth from God. So these confused Bible teachers feel the need to twist the very words of Jesus to save him from making a false prediction. But they are confused. It's not Jesus who got it wrong, but these Bible teachers are getting it wrong. They're not reading the Olivet Discourse correctly, but are taking it out of context. Therefore, they can't understand what Jesus is saying. When Jesus talks, I think this is what they hear.
I tell you what, man, you did that dang old Mr. Tambourine Man talk about did come play a song for me, then you good dude.
What did that guy say? Anyway, we know Jesus is right, even if we can't understand him yet, and he doesn't need us to save him. He's the one who saves us, remember? Rather, all this first part of Matthew 24 is about the destruction of the temple, as I will explain as the series continues. But to show you that there are good Bible teachers who get it right, and that I'm not the only one saying this, here's what R.T. France says in his Matthew commentary. Quote, those who interpret this passage as referring to the parousia, that means second coming, must therefore either conclude that it proved to be untrue or that this generation does not here carry its normal meaning. It has, for instance, been taken to mean the Jewish race or unbelieving Judaism. It is unlikely that such an improbable meaning for the noun would have been suggested at all without the constraint of apologetic embarrassment. End quote. He's saying those who teach wrongly this is about the second coming have to choose. Either Jesus made a prediction that was untrue, or this generation has another meaning. He continues to say another meaning is improbable, and no one would have even suggested it except an embarrassed apologist. An apologist is someone trying to defend the Bible. And the reason they're embarrassed is because Jesus made a false prediction, at least on their scheme. So they end up twisting his words, thinking Jesus needs their help. But that's foolish. It would be better to accept that Jesus got it all right, which he did, and realize that you just don't understand him yet. Now, I said I would show you the meaning of this generation in context. So let me show you one more thing. When Jesus uses this language, he's referring to the Old Testament. The Olivet Discourse relies deeply on knowledge of the Old Testament, since the original audience lived in a culture shaped by it. The Old Testament is the context in which we must read it. Jesus' use of this generation calls back to the Exodus, which is the founding story of his Jewish audience, the disciples. They would have made the connection because it was their cultural context. You'll recall when the Israelites came out of Egypt, there was an older generation who did not enter the promised land, and a younger generation, their children, who did enter. The older generation saw God's miracles, the 10 plagues, the parting of the Red Sea, yet they rejected Yahweh and worshipped a golden calf, among other things. The punishment for the older generation was to wander in the desert for 40 years until they were all dead, except 3. When the younger generation finally enters the promised land, Moses tells them what God said about the older generation. Deuteronomy 1:34. And the Lord heard your words and was angered, and he swore, not one of these men of this evil generation shall see the good land that I swore to give to your fathers, except Caleb the son of Jephunneh. In other words, Yahweh says of the older generation, this generation is an evil generation. Well, that's what Jesus said. He's calling back to the Exodus to say, just as they rejected Yahweh after seeing all his power and miracles, this generation I'm living with has rejected the Messiah after seeing his power and miracles. You people are just like them. But that can only apply to the generation alive at that time because they saw and heard the Messiah, Jesus, in person and were eyewitnesses to his miracles. It can only refer to people alive at that time because no future generation has seen Jesus in the flesh. Also, the 40 years of wandering after the Exodus establishes the biblical time frame for a generation. And how long was it from when Jesus gave his Olivet Discourse in 30 AD to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD? 40 years, exactly one biblical generation. His Jewish disciples would have understood the Exodus connection because it was so important to them, and they knew the Old Testament, which defined their culture. We modern people struggle to understand all this, but we can when we read the text in its context as if we were first century Jews. Now, I could show you more evidence, but this has already been way too much information for such a straightforward text. But I had to go through it because this is where the battle lines are drawn. This is where we find Bible teachers twisting the scriptures, Christians denying the teaching of Christ. Brothers, that should not be. In the next video, I'll return to the beginning of Jesus' answer, and we will see what wars and rumors of wars, earthquakes, famines, and pestilence are signs of. In summary, this generation refers to the people living in the time Jesus walked the earth. He is saying that all the events of Matthew 24, 4 through 31, will take place during the lifetime of its disciples, and they did take place in the Jewish-Roman War, which resulted in the temple's destruction in 70 AD. 40 years on, exactly one biblical generation, as defined by the Exodus, which is the context for this saying. So please join me on the next video, same bat time, same bat channel on YouTube. God bless you all.